read 8 books this past month, so now I'm going to tell you about all of them so that you can pick ones that you might want to add to your TBR. Before we get started, a quick disclaimer. Just because I feel a certain way about a book doesn't mean that you will too. If you love something that I hate or hate something that I love, that's okay. Diversity of opinion is encouraged. Now that that's out of the way, let's get started. Starting with the Anthropocene Reviewed. I am gonna ruffle some feathers with this one. I feel like I have an unpopular opinion on this book. The book jacket says that this is a collection of personal essays that reviews different facets of a human-centered planet on a 5-star scale. Are you confused? Because I was too. Here's what this book actually is. Bite-sized chapters in which John Green reviews a topic, like whispering, for example, and he talks about A, his connection to it, like when his daughter whispered in his ear when they were home alone, and B, what that subject says about our shared human condition. Like how whispering reminds people to slow down their loud, busy lives and make a quiet, safe space for other people. He then assigns the subject a somewhat arbitrary star rating to demonstrate the ridiculousness of the 5-star rating system. Whispering, for example, gets something like 4 stars. Let's start with what I liked. I learned a lot about John Green, and he seems like a delightful guy. It was a funny and touching read full of love and empathy for humans, and it made me rethink rating things on a 5-star scale system. Upon reflection, I've kind of realized that metric is arbitrary at best and harmful at worst, so I've decided to only give books a star rating when I think that they're 5 stars. Positive reinforcement only in this household. Now on to the not so great. This book gets a lot of hype, and to be honest, I don't get it. I do think that this is mostly my fault. When I read Anthropocene Reviewed, I was expecting a series of essays on environmentalism and climate change, and I didn't get that, so I was a little let down when I realized what the book actually was. That's not a fault of John Green, and more, I would say, really just a fault of me not carefully reading the book jacket, but also the marketing team for not making a book jacket that actually tells you what the book is about. And I will also say that I'm not a huge nonfiction girly, and when I do pick up nonfiction, it's because I want to learn something new, or I want to learn a new way to think about something, and I didn't really get either of those things from this book. Yeah, I am now rethinking reading things according to a 5-star scale, and I did learn a few new fun facts, but otherwise I left this book very much the same Adelaide as I did when I went into it, and that's just not why I personally pick up nonfiction. Overall, it was fine, but I don't think it's ever going to occupy my 2 brain cells again. On to a more positive note is Our Wives Under the Sea by Julia Armfield. When Leah returns home from a deep-sea mission that has gone catastrophically wrong, Miri thinks that she finally has her wife back. It soon becomes clear, though, that Leah is not the same. Whatever happened in that submarine, Leah has brought part of it back with her. This is billed as a psychological horror, but I don't really think that's what this is. I'd say this is more literary fiction with flavors, undernotes of suspense. Like the Anthropocene Reviewed, this was not what I thought it was going to be, but unlike the Anthropocene Reviewed, I really loved this. This little book is like Yuji Itadori because she packs a punch. It's a thoughtful meditation on grief and PTSD with absolutely gorgeous prose. For example, I remember her legs, the smudge of green bruises, synthetic citrus smell of her underarms. I remember the way that her hair rose static from the crown and then fell again. I remember the way that she looked at me, the open surge of her gaze, like I was something she'd invented, brought to life by the powers of electricity and set down there in the last of the light. Bonus points go to this because it features sapphic love for the sake of sapphic love. It's a book in which the main characters happen to be gay rather than a book in which the gay characters face homophobia or deal with coming out. And don't get me wrong, those are incredibly important stories. I think they're very powerful and I love to read them. And sometimes it's nice to just read about different aspects of queer love. She wasn't all sunshine and roses though. I have some beef with Julia Armfield because she presented us with a lot of mysteries in this novel and then she dipped before answering literally any of them. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the reader is supposed to feel kind of lost at sea, but nevertheless, the ending just felt a little bit lacking to me because of that. Also, there was a little too much content about the deep sea and submarines that just didn't seem to move the story forward in any way. And when you are writing such a slim book as this, I think it's really important to make every single word and every single passage count for something. So I think it just would have been a little bit better had she spent those moments instead diving more deeply into the psyches of the characters or further fleshing out the relationship between Leah and Miri. This is me nitpicking though, because overall I really did love this one. Speaking of horror novels, I finally got around to reading Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. If you're not familiar with the story, what it is that a young woman marries a widower and moves in with him to his mansion. Once she's there, she can't shake the feeling that she's being haunted by the shadow of his dead wife, Rebecca. Can she escape Rebecca's grip on the mansion, or will it consume her and her husband? Part of the reason that it has taken me so long to get around to reading this is I'm honestly ashamed to tell you this, but I need to be honest about these kinds of things. There is something tragically wrong with me, and it's that I thought this copy was so ugly that I did not want to read it. It's squat, the print is just so tiny. I don't like this kind of mass market $3 paperback vibe, and every time I looked at it I thought, that's disgusting, I don't want to pick this up. But then I was like, Adelaide, you are 26 years old, you need to grow up and read this book. So I did, and again I might ruffle some feathers here because I do kind of have mixed feelings on this one. To be honest, I was fairly bored for most of the novel, but when it picked up hard. The best part about this book is its beautiful atmospheric writing. All of her descriptions work overtime. They capture the gorgeous, sinister, haunting environment at the same time that they also further character relationships and deepen character development. While the writing was gorgeous, it was also repetitive. Yes, I know that the mansion was haunted. And yes, I know that the housekeeper doesn't like the narrator. You have already told me this, let's get on with it. Also, I loved watching the narrator grow up and become more confident in herself. I really cared about her and I rooted for her even if I didn't really agree with all of her choices. Speaking of bad choices, we're getting on to my main gripe with this book, which is that I had zero reason to root for the love interest. In fact, I actively despised him for literally the entire book. I felt no differently about him by the end. If anything, I hated him even more at the end. I didn't believe that his feelings were genuine or deep, and I don't feel that there was good enough reason for the narrator to love him as much as she seems to love him. I just wasn't buying it. And that's not what you want when you're reading a romance book. My final gripe with this is that for a novel that's written by a woman and features strong female characters, it was really hard on women and very easy on men. However, considering that this came out in 1938, this is to be expected. Lukewarm feelings on this one, but I'm sure it's a classic for a reason, so feel free to give it a read and convince me to like it more. Up next, we've got Run Less, Run Faster. I bet you have no idea what this book is about. If you don't like running, feel free to use the time cards below to skip to the next book. I promise I will not be offended. This book is written by the head honchos of the Furman Institute for Running and Scientific Training, aka FIRST. The method that it lays out has been proven to be effective by several exercise science studies. I got this book because I'm training for a half marathon, and so I wanted to A, just kind of understand the nitty-gritty behind running a little bit more. B, I wanted a running plan that was the right intensity, and C, I also wanted a running training program that was only going to be about 3 days a week so that I could continue to strength train a few times a week as well. Reddit pointed me in the direction of this book, and I typically say that no good comes from going on Reddit, but it actually really pulled through this time. This is a great book and a solid training plan if you have prior running experience. If you're an absolute beginner, I would not recommend this to you because there are no easy runs or recovery runs, and all of the workouts are at a pretty high intensity. If your bones ain't used to it, then your bones will be hurting. Beyond just the training plan, this book also has advice on things like nutrition, recovery, cross-training, supplementation, rehabbing injuries, and masters running. All around, a great educational resource on running. Back to the world of fiction, we have got The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath. This is the OG sad girl novel. The Bell Jar chronicles the descent of a young woman into madness, as well as her journey to recovery. With poetic prose and razor-sharp concision, it depicts what it's like to have a mental breakdown so acutely and accurately that at several points in time, I found myself believing that the crazed antics of Esther were actually rational. I think what I like most about this book isn't the fact that it chronicles a mental breakdown, but that it chronicles the uneven and difficult, but also hopeful journey to recovery. However, this book loses points because there are some very homophobic and very racist passages that are just not okay. And it depicts mental illness in this very dramatic Hollywood way where you're like, throwing your clothes off the balcony of your hotel in New York City, when in actuality, for me, mental health issues are really just like laying in bed and looking at TikToks. But if you're like me and you love sad girl novels, then you'll love this one. Up next, we have got Young Mungo. Time for Adelaide's controversial take yet again. This follows a teenage boy named Mungo who is growing up in the projects of Glasgow, trying to deal with the shitty family that he has and also falling in love with another neighborhood boy named James. But when his family catches on to his love affair, things go from bad to worse. Can Mungo and James escape their grim circumstances to get to a place of safety where they can be together? This is a moving psychological portrait of a tender soul that is growing up in a cruel world. This covers a lot of really hard topics with an unflinching eye, like the balance of masculinity, intergenerational trauma, and violence against queer people. It renders the psyches of every character in vivid detail, even those that you only meet once or twice. And the result is a full-color portrait of Glasgow, complete with complex characters that feel so alive that they practically jump off the page. With all of that said, I have a really hard time recommending this book to anyone, and I'll tell you why. The abuse was so over the top that it almost felt like trauma porn. Trigger warnings galore for this book. Think of a trigger warning. Any trigger warning. It is in this book or your money back guaranteed. And I don't mean this as a knock on the book or on Douglas Stewart's talent at all, because he is truly a phenomenal writer and this truly is a remarkable book. But this is just such a heavy novel that I found myself not wanting to come back to it. I almost DNF'd this at several different points because every time I picked it up, I just felt so sad and disgusted. If you like books that just kick you into the gutter and just curb stomp you over and over and over again until you feel like a little used piece of trash, then you'll probably really like this book. But if you don't want to read something that has very graphic depictions of violence and sexual assault, stay away from this for now. I really can't recommend this to anyone. Last but not least, we've got my favorite of the 8 books. We are ending on a high with If an Egyptian Cannot Speak English. In this novel, an Egyptian-American woman immigrates to Cairo and meets an Egyptian man. The two strike up a love affair that takes a violent turn neither of them expected. The description will have you believe this is a romance novel, but that is certainly not the case. This is first and foremost a novel about race, power, class, and American identity politics. And it's also about the expectations that we put on minorities to tell their stories to us in the right way. It experiments a lot with form, which might sound intimidating, but it's actually done in a very accessible manner. So anybody can read this and really understand it and feel its power. I won't spoil anything, but it's told in 3 different parts, and each part has its own unique form, and it's the form just as much as the narrative that makes you think about the message and the characters in new and different ways. I have never read something structured quite like this, and I mean that in a good way. It made me realize that Americans ignorantly expect minorities to conform their narratives to our culture, to market their book in a way that we find socially palatable and acceptable. And I think it is really brave of Noor Naga to tell us her story and the way that she experienced it, even if it feels not very woke to us Americans. I have very few complaints with this novel, and the main one that I have is a very small thing, and it's that it's not really made apparent that this novel is told in two different perspectives. So I had no idea for the first 40 pages, and I was incredibly confused. And I don't think that it would have messed with the message or the form for the author to have just made it a little bit more apparent that two different people were speaking. However, that's just me nitpicking. I would highly recommend this. It's a short read, but I know that it's one that I'll be thinking about for a very long time. I wouldn't be surprised if it makes it on my favorites of 2024 list at the end of the year. And that's a wrap on what I read in the month of January and the year of our Lord 2024. Have you read any of these books? If so, what did you think about them? Let me know in the comments below. I read all of my comments and I really care what you have to say. Look out for a vlog coming your way in the next couple weeks, but until then, be kind to others, take care of yourself, and read what you love.